Nur al-Din's eyes if there was any chance of defeating the Crusaders. And there was also a big worry on the part of Nur al-Din that if we don't take it, the Crusaders might.
The Crusaders also coveted Cairo. Egypt was a rich and strategically positioned country, and in the early 1160s, it was up for grabs. Egypt wanted to remain independent. It was the stronghold of the Shia branch of Islam, and was just as determined to resist Nur al-Din's Sunni Orthodox Muslims as the Christians. But in 1168, the Christians made a fatal mistake and handed Nur al-Din a great advantage. The Crusaders perpetrated a brutal massacre of Shia Muslims in an Egyptian town near Cairo.
If the Crusaders have acted differently, they would have taken Cairo with the greatest of ease. For the city notables were ready to surrender it. But when they heard of the massacres perpetrated by the Christians, they decided to resist. The Egyptians were left with little choice but to plead with Nur al-Din for help.
Nur al-Din was only too eager to help. He sent in his most talented and ambitious young general to help the Egyptians defend Cairo. His name was Saladin. To the Muslim world, Saladin is a legend. His heroic reputation was carefully crafted by one man, his close friend and confidant, Baha al-Din.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمد.
Baha al-Din was close to and a great admirer of Saladin.
sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. I bore witness to the genuineness of the rare stories told about the noble hero, Saladin.
Like a medieval spin doctor, he put a gloss on the great deeds of his master.
One could swear that from the time he set out, he did not spend one silver coin except on a jihad.
Saladin shared his master Nur al-Din's ambition to control both Syria and Egypt and drive out the Crusaders, but under his own leadership. And that meant taking on Nur al-Din himself. His first step was to assume command of all of Egypt from the Shia rulers, by any means necessary.
The fact that some people who were in Saladin's way, in his path to power, conveniently died at appropriate moments, has led other people to suggest at the time and since that Saladin had something to do with those convenient demises. That's impossible to prove. People did die with distressing regularity.
By the end of 1169, with all his rivals conveniently out of the way, Saladin was now the unchallenged ruler of Egypt, controlling as much territory as his mentor, Nur al-Din.
Nur al-Din used to call Saladin the ambitious. Definitely, Nur al-Din wanted to punish Saladin for his treason.
5 years later, before he could cut his young lieutenant down to size, Nur al-Din died under mysterious circumstances. He was 57. Saladin rushed from Cairo to Nur al-Din's fortress stronghold, Aleppo, but a successor had already been announced. The son of Nur al-Din was the new ruler of Syria, al-Salih. He was just 12. But young as he was, al-Salih was no pushover. He refused to allow Saladin to enter the city and forced his army to camp outside the gates of Aleppo. The young leader then took his boldest step. He called on the services of a group of religious fundamentalist hitmen to eliminate his rival. Their name has gone down in history: the Assassins.
The word assassin is derived from hashishin. And hashish, we all know, is marijuana. And the story was that the only way they could be worked up to go and kill someone was by drugging them out of their skulls.
The assassins tracked Saladin down to his tent outside the city walls. They got through his guards, killing one of them. Saladin was lucky to escape with only a flesh wound.
The assassination of Saladin would have been a tremendous blow to the cause. And when the assassin actually got into his tent, must have created total panic. You can just imagine it.
A year passed before Saladin returned, determined to capture Aleppo. This time he was taking no chances. He ringed his quarters with guards and even scattered chalk dust and cinders around the tent to detect footprints. Still, despite the security, the assassins struck again, in a curious and disturbing way. By his pillow, they left a present, some pastries, and with them a death note, warning Saladin to retreat, or next time they would succeed in assassinating him. Saladin fled Aleppo again. It was 7 years before Saladin's fortunes changed. In 1181, his rival, al-Salih, now 19 years old, died. Like his father and grandfather before him, another victim to die in uncertain circumstances.
I have no problems in believing that Saladin was ruthless. What's the problem? I mean, in order to survive in that world, you had to be. Whether he was responsible for the killing of Nur al-Din's son, one doesn't know.
Syria and Egypt now belonged to Saladin. 80 years of Muslim disunity were over.
Now he has encircled the Crusader states. He is threatening to strangle them into oblivion. And I think what we can see happening as far as the Crusaders are concerned is a real heightening of the temperature, a heightening of the level of threat, and an awareness that really things are moving inexorably towards some kind of serious confrontation.
Having fought and bullied the Muslim world into a coalition, Saladin would now have to deliver a knockout blow against the Christians of the Holy Land. By 1183, Saladin was at last ready to strike against the Christians and claim Jerusalem. The ambition of the greatest Muslim leader in the century hung like a cloud over the Crusaders as they prepared to do battle for their kingdom.
Any rise in Saladin's power was a cause for suspicion in our eyes. He was a man wise in counsel and valiant in war. So we had great reason to fear that when Saladin had increased his empire twofold, he would rise against the kingdom with greater force and harass us more violently than ever.
While the Muslims were unified, the Christians in Jerusalem were at their weakest. They were led by Baldwin IV, a king who from an early age had been crippled by disease.
He was playing one day, and as playful boys do, they began to pinch each other's arms. The other boys gave evidence of pain. Baldwin felt nothing. As he began to reach years of maturity, it became apparent that he was suffering from the terrible disease of leprosy. Impossible to refrain from tears when speaking of this great misfortune. Day by day his condition grew worse.
Baldwin became so ill, it was clear he could no longer rule his kingdom. In the autumn of 1183, from his sickbed, he appointed his brother-in-law, Guy of Lusignan, as regent of the realm. Many thought Guy too weak to rule, but he was determined to prove his leadership by taking on the might of Saladin. He would be helped by an ally at court, a brutal prince with a deep hatred of Saladin, Reynald of Chatillon. It was Reynald who would trigger the long-awaited war. For 4 decades, Christians had respected the rights of Muslims to pass through their territory on trade routes between Egypt and Syria. But in January 1187, Reynaud broke the truce. He launched an unprovoked attack on a richly laden Muslim caravan. He took the noblemen and women prisoner and plundered their possessions.
He seized it treacherously, taking the booty, animals, and weapons. He threw all the travelers in dungeons, maltreating and torturing them. When they reminded him of the truth, he replied, "Tell your Muhammad to release you."
When news of this attack was brought to Saladin, he said, "This is unacceptable, killing unarmed pilgrims on their way to worship, and whatever else I do or don't do, this is one head I must have."
Reynaud's brutal attack gave Saladin his excuse for war. He gathered a formidable army, drawn from every corner of his empire. With 20,000 foot soldiers and over 10,000 cavalry, he marched towards Hattin, near the shores of Lake Galilee.
Till that point that army was created, Saladin was viewed essentially as an important leader, but one amongst many, who had basically been fighting his own side in order to achieve this unity. The first big chance for him to show what this army he had created was capable of doing was at the Battle of Hattin.
In June 1187, the forces that Saladin had gathered began to assemble in this broad plain down behind me here. We can imagine streams of Muslim horsemen and foot soldiers coming in from Iraq, from Syria, from Egypt.
Saladin had thrown down the gauntlet, and Guy had to respond. He assembled the entire Christian force from castles and cities across the kingdom. 1,300 knights, including Templars and Hospitallers, and 15,000 foot soldiers.
14 miles in that direction, behind that modern settlement and over the hills, was Safaria, the base where the Frankish army gathered.
As their standard, they carried the most prized holy relic, the true cross. They believed it would protect them from defeat and ensure victory. Today, many Catholics still believe in the power of holy relics. In a tranquil monastery in Jerusalem, protected in a gold reliquary, lies a fragment of what is said to be the true cross.
The very little piece of wood in form of a cross is a part of the real cross on which Jesus was crucified. The cross is so precious to us. Can you imagine? We should not consider relics as magic objects. If we are protected by a relic, this is because God protects us, or His holy angels protect us.
Believing God was on their side, Guy, Reynaud, and the Christian army were ready to face Saladin.
On July the 3rd, the Franks set out from their camp at Safaria in good order. Initially, the march went reasonably well, but as the day wore on, it got hotter and hotter and hotter.
With no water in the desert plains, the heavily armored Christian army suffered from severe dehydration.
In the heat of the day, the Franks were struggling intensely. They began to slowly lose cohesion, they began to lose formation. And like an enormous train slowly running out of momentum, going up a long, long hill, they ground to a halt. They were there in an open place, no water, hardly anything to eat.
Then, like an oasis in the distance, the Christians spotted Lake Galilee, a chance at last to quench their thirst. Saladin's biographer, Baha al-Din, revealed how that day his master laid a trap for the Christians.
The Christians, surrounding themselves with infantry, tried to fight their way towards the lake in the hope of reaching water. But Saladin realized their objective and planted himself and his army in the way.
Saladin and his men now stood between the Crusader army and the lake. Guy of Lusignan had no option. In a desperate bid to reach the water, he ordered a charge on Saladin's men. weakened Crusader knights were no match for Saladin's highly disciplined army. Charge after charge was repelled by the Muslims. And at the end of the day, Saladin still had another trick up his sleeve.
In the summer, this place is a tinderbox. This stuff's incredibly dry. Saladin compounded the Crusaders' thirst by setting fire to it, and the smoke was driven onto the Crusaders by the wind and made their throats even drier.
The Muslim soldiers piled on the misery, creating a terrible constant noise, drums, cymbals, chanting, to inflict fear and foreboding on the Crusader army.
It must have been an awful experience to be stuck out in the open, knowing that really the following day you were likely to meet your death.
On the morning of July 4th, the Christians who remained prepared to make a final stand.
The foot soldiers saw here the Horns of Hattin, an old Iron Age fort where they thought they could be safe. They marched up this ascent here, and here in the crater was set up the red tent of King Guy of Lusignan. You can imagine here in this crater very evocative scenes. The few remaining 100 horsemen twirling around, trying to get themselves organised.
Chronicles record that the sacred gold reliquary holding the precious relic of the True Cross was hustled into Guy's red tent for safety. As the exhausted Christians began to collapse, the disciplined Muslim army closed in for the kill. Sensing victory, Saladin commanded his troops to capture Guy, Reynald, and the red tent.
I was at the Sultan's side when we saw the Franks retreating before the Muslim onslaught. And I cried out for joy. We have conquered them. The Sultan turns to me and said, be quiet. We will not have beaten them until the tent falls. As he spoke, the tent fell.
The relic of the True Cross was seized. Saladin's victory over the Crusaders seemed to be complete. July 1187. The Battle of Hattin was over. Saladin had defeated the Crusader army. Finally, he was face to face with his sworn enemy, Reynald. Saladin wanted revenge for the brutal attack on the Muslim caravan.
He had given orders for both Prince Reynald and the king of the Franks, Guy, to be brought before him. The king complained of thirst, so the Sultan had a glass of rose water brought for him, from which he drank. And then he passed it on to Reynald. The Sultan cried out at the king, "This godless man did not have my permission to drink and will not save his life that way." And with one hand, cut off Reynald's head.
Guy assumed he would be next.
Saladin assured him very peacefully, very gently, that kings, he said literally, kings do not kill kings. And Renaud was an evil man and he deserved to be killed because of his evil deeds. And that was really the exception and not the norm.
But there was no mercy for the Hospitallers and the Templars, the finest knights of the Crusader states, dedicated to fighting the forces of Islam.
The Sultan chose to put them to death, to kill them all without exception.
It was partially the decision of Saladin to impose some shock and awe. These, you say, are your best warriors. There, they exist no longer.
Losing the Battle of Hattin was a catastrophe for the Crusader states in the Holy Land.
Guy and the King of Jerusalem had lost almost everything. They had stripped almost every castle, almost every city of its defenders. They had, as it were, gathered up all their dice in their hand and thrown it, and they had all turned up wrong.
the Christian army had been annihilated, and the king of Jerusalem was now a prisoner of Saladin. Saladin's dream was finally realized.
I think it's true to say that Hattin is a key victory for Saladin, and that he's aware that this is a moment in history in which he's going to be able to make his mark in Islam.
Saladin could justify all the years of struggle to bring his people together. He had delivered the crushing victory they so desired.
They drank the cup of fate, and the spears courted them. The horses' hooves massed dust clouds for them, merged together by the thunder of neighing horses, and the lightning of polished swords flashing alongside them. This was a hard day for the unbelievers. God decreed the victory of our faith.
The captured gold reliquary containing the fragment of the true cross was paraded through the streets of Damascus, a final insult to the Christians. In fact, the Christian defeat had been foretold 2 years earlier by their official chronicler, William of Tyre.
Wearied by the sad disasters which are occurring in the kingdom so frequently, indeed, almost continually, I have resolved to abandon the pen and commit to the silence of the tomb the chronicle of events which we had undertaken to write for posterity.
Saladin swept through the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem. Acre, Caesarea, and Jaffa all quickly fell. In October 1187, the Muslim army reached the greatest prize of all, Jerusalem. They set up camp outside the walls and prepared to lay siege to the city.
The defenders begged for mercy. At first, Saladin wasn't minded to grant the Christians this. He wanted to slaughter them in the way that the Crusaders had killed the Muslims back in 1099.
Inside Jerusalem, the Christians knew they stood no chance in a siege against Saladin and his mighty army. So they played a clever psychological game. If Saladin attacked the city, they threatened to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of Islam's most sacred sites.
Saladin thought about this. He decided to take a prudent line of action. He would spare the Christians if they paid a ransom. This was agreed, and Saladin entered the holy city, his goal, his target, in peace.
For our Lord Saladin, this was a great victory. A great victory.
The reason he is hero-worshipped in the Arab world is that he was the one who took back Jerusalem, made it an open city once again for believers of the book, and transformed the fortunes of that world.
Jerusalem was in Muslim hands again, and it had been taken peacefully, unlike the Crusader occupation 88 years earlier. But the Muslims showed their contempt for the Christians in symbolic ways.
When Saladin's victorious troops entered Jerusalem in October 1187, one of the first things they did was to tear the cross off the Dome of the Rock and have that cross dragged through the streets of Jerusalem, kicked, abused, spat on.
The Crusader kingdoms were crushed. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through the Christian world. But not for long. Almost immediately, there would be a call for a third crusade. The shocking news of the Crusaders' defeat at Hattin in 1187, and especially the loss of Jerusalem, reverberated throughout the West. Almost immediately, Pope Gregory VIII made an emotional appeal for a third crusade.
Anyone of sane mind who does not weep would seem to have forgotten not only his Christian faith, but even his very humanity. With those savage barbarians thirsting after Christian blood, and using all their force to profane the holy places and banish the worship of God from the land.
The difference for the Third Crusade as opposed to the Second is that now Western Europe has a very clear goal. It's very clear what this crusade is going to be about. It's going to be about getting Jerusalem back. And the kind of shockwaves that went through Western Europe after Hattin and after the loss of Jerusalem were immense.
Europe's most powerful leaders rallied to reclaim the holy city of Jerusalem once and for all. In May 1189, the first army of 100,000 men left Germany, led by Emperor Frederick Barbarossa.
Emperor Frederick Barbarossa was the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Western Europe. He'd been on the throne for over 40 years by this time. He was a veteran from the Second Crusade, one of the few men still living at the time of the Third Crusade. His authority was enormous. Saladin was terrified. He knew that this was the strongest card that the Christians had to play.
But Barbarossa drowned in a freak accident crossing a river on the way to Jerusalem. Most of his vast army lost heart and turned for home. This left the newly crowned King of England at the head of the largest Crusader army, the 33-year-old Richard I.
In our mind, we think of him as one of the greatest kings of England, one of the mythical kings of the English past. In reality, he probably thought of himself far more as what we might think of today as a Frenchman, because his key lands were in what we now think of as France, and the Angevin Empire, which held England and large parts of the continent, stretched throughout what we now think of as the French world.
Richard I was the son of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and already an experienced general. He'd spent most of his life fighting in Europe, and knew that success in battle required a full war chest.
He's very aware that crusading costs money, and that if he wants to prosecute a successful crusade, and he wants to achieve his goals, he's got to have the financial backing necessary. To do this, he's prepared to literally take money anywhere he can get it.
A new tax, called the Saladin Tithe, had been levied to finance this Third Crusade. In addition, Richard sold everything he owned, castles, towns, and lordships, to ensure he could buy the very best military hardware. It was said he would have sold London if he could have. He was determined not to repeat the fiasco of the Second Crusade. His was to be the best organized and most highly equipped campaign ever. After 14 months of preparation, Richard set off to the Holy Land on the Third Crusade. Meanwhile, confident in his power, Saladin decided to release his prisoner Guy of Lusignan. He believed the deposed Christian king was no longer a threat.
The Sultan had undertaken to release King Guy. He stipulated that the king should not draw sword against him ever again, and he would be his servant forever. But the king broke faith, and God cursed him.
But Guy, breaking his pledge to Saladin, gathered his remaining forces and set out to redeem himself and rebuild his kingdom.
He was a man who'd been humiliated. He was shamed in the eyes of Christendom. He was the man who'd lost the holy city of Jerusalem. In order to get his reputation back, he had to do something spectacular. And he settled upon a very, very bold idea indeed. Here we see the city of Acre. It was the most important port in the Levant. It could be the base of a new, wealthy kingdom. He was a king without a kingdom. He needed to start somewhere.
The fortified port of Acre had fallen to Saladin's forces soon after the loss of Jerusalem. Now, with his army of 400 knights and 7,000 foot soldiers, Guy was determined to take it back.
We can actually see some of the area that he attacked here, looking at this map. We have down here the Tower of Flies, which you can see out there in the harbour, and stretched along there are the sea walls. And this really is the medieval city that Guy had chosen to besiege. He set his troops up in a ring around here, and that was where he entrenched his men and dug in.
The Muslims inside Acre bombarded Guy's army with stones, rocks, even body parts. Word of the siege got back to Saladin, and his army charged down the coast to help defend the city. With Saladin's forces in place, Guy and his besieging army couldn't break through. Over 2 punishing years, Muslims and Christians fought an on-and-off battle over Acre. Guy knew that to break the deadlock, he would need help, and it would come. Richard I and his army of 17,000 were on the way. In June 1191, after months of meticulous preparation and a year-long journey, Richard I of England and his 17,000-strong army arrived in Acre.
The accursed King of England arrived. His coming had a great ceremony, for he was a mighty warrior of great courage. And his coming had a dread and frightening effect on the heart of the Muslims.
Richard and his men were an instant source of inspiration to the weary Christian army. Richard seized control of the battle, and within weeks, he broke the deadlock.
He came with the cutting edge of Western military technology. He had enormous siege engines, which he was able to bring with him. These things were almost individual characters to the Crusaders. They had names like God's Own Catapult and Bad Neighbour, and they struck the fear of God into their Muslim opponents.
Siege engines brought in pieces and then reassembled in the east allowed the Crusaders to intensify their bombardment of Acre and to get right up to the wall. But the chronicles reveal how Saladin managed to counterattack these huge towers. A Syrian soldier offered Saladin a recipe for Greek fire, a kind of medieval napalm. Made from crude oil and sticky wood resin, it was devastating, burning to a cinder anything or anyone in its path.
This is actually very difficult stuff to make, and the key component is naphtha, because naphtha provides sticky fire. That is fire which will not merely splash all over something, that's not so difficult, but will stick to it and hold and set it afire.
Volley after volley of Greek fire rained onto the Crusader army. Suddenly, Richard was on the defensive, as all 3 of his giant siege towers went up in flames.
The blazing meteors of Greek fire hit their targets. They were consumed in flames.
Deprived of his great war machines, Richard desperately needed a new strategy. He offered his soldiers 4 gold coins for every stone they could remove from the base of one of the towers.
What he did was to put so much effort onto one particular point that a breach in the wall was created. There was a gaping hole through which the Crusaders would be able to enter the city.
After 5 weeks of fighting, Richard's troops broke through the walls of Acre, capturing the city and taking 2,700 of Saladin's men hostage. The unimpeded rise of Saladin had been brought to a halt. Baha al-Din witnessed the impact of this defeat on the Muslim leader.
I came into Saladin's prisons. He was like a parent bereft of a child. I offered him what comfort I could and exhorted him to think of his duty to Palestine and Jerusalem, and to save the Muslims left in the city.
Acre was a great victory for the Crusaders and for Richard. His courage in battle gained him fame throughout the Christian world, and with it, a new name, Richard the Lionheart. The Third Crusade could now advance to Jerusalem to recapture the Holy City. But first, Richard had to deal with the thousands of hostages. He issued an ultimatum to Saladin. The men would be released in return for a ransom of 200,000 gold pieces and the return of the relic of the True Cross.
Negotiations dragged on, And Richard the Lionhearted began to conclude, probably correctly, that Saladin was using those hostages as a way to drag out the negotiations and wear down the Franks. Richard became increasingly frustrated. And eventually he did something that some people have considered a war crime, and that he was criticized for at the time.
Richard's actions that day at Acre have gone down in history as one of the most ruthless episodes throughout all the Crusades.
The enemy brought out the prisoners for whom God had decreed martyrdom. With the sword, they killed them in a cool blood.
The massacre of the Muslim prisoners that were taken in Acre is still talked about. It was a very brutal episode. Richard was totally brutal, in my opinion.
Richard took such drastic action because he believed he had no alternative. And in the coldest, most stark military terms, it's true. These men were a drain on him. He had to feed them, he had to look after them, he had to guard them. He was hardly going to release them. They'd come and attack him again. So what he did was try to resolve the situation quickly and effectively. It was a terribly brutal thing to do, but it enabled him to carry on his momentum, to begin to march south and to fulfill his mission of recapturing the Holy City.
The triumphant Crusader force of 12,000 men left Acre in August 1191 and marched south toward their final goal, Jerusalem. Saladin had to stop Richard the Lionheart's march south toward Jerusalem. If not, he risked losing the Holy City and his grip on the Muslim world.
When the Crusaders left Acre, they were in super confident mood. They were convinced that they would be able to defeat the Muslims. They set out in a very, very particular formation. Inland were the foot soldiers with their vital role of protecting the heavy cavalry. The cavalry themselves were lined up with the Templars at the front and the Hospitallers at the back, the strongest men to protect the most vulnerable parts of the march. Then, between the cavalry and the sea, came the baggage train, the weakest, the slowest, the most difficult bit to defend. Then finally, out to sea there, came the Crusader fleet, essential to keep the army supplied. This was a textbook march.
The Third Crusade had become a war of wills between two great men, Richard and Saladin. Both were warriors, diplomats, and strategists of the highest order. Saladin was determined to draw the Crusaders into battle. He bombarded them constantly, but Richard was unstoppable.
And what he demonstrates in this period is enormous charisma as a military leader and enormous discipline. He shows himself to be able to keep his troops marching, even as they're being peppered by arrows. We hear about people having 10 arrows sticking out of them and still staying in formation, still marching. This completely wrecks Saladin's plan to pick off the Crusaders as they're making this march. And it's this discipline that shows Richard was a true military genius.
Richard's army survived the onslaught by Saladin and reached the Crusader town of Jaffa in September 1191. A month later, he left the coast and rode inland towards Jerusalem. Richard was now tantalizingly close to the Holy City. But then he made a monumental and startling decision that shocked his army to the core, and has been debated by historians ever since.
It was 45 miles from Jaffa to Jerusalem, yet Richard stopped a few miles short of the Holy City. He'd come to realise that if the Crusaders captured it, they would not be able to hold on to it. The masses in the army were furious. They'd come to free the Holy City. They couldn't countenance not attacking it. Richard overruled them, turned them round, and went back to the coast.
Richard feared his depleted force of 12,000 men couldn't hope to take the Holy City and defend it against Saladin's vast army, drawn from across the Muslim world. He had failed in the primary mission of the Third Crusade, to recapture Jerusalem.
Deep in his heart and deep in his motivation, I think, was a real desire to march on Jerusalem and to take this holy city. That was what the Crusade was all about. But at the same time, he was also a general and he was a king. And so he knew that military sense told him Jerusalem could not be taken, he didn't have the resources, and at the very best, it couldn't be held even if he managed to take it through some miracle.
In the spring of 1192, Richard returned to Acre, the coastal town captured 8 months earlier. He decided to consolidate the cities he had taken along the coast, leaving the door open for a future crusade. But his decision handed the initiative back to his arch-rival Saladin. No longer forced to protect Jerusalem, Saladin launched a lightning attack on the coastal town of Jaffa, next to modern-day Tel Aviv.
Here at Jaffa, Saladin tried to break the Christian stranglehold on the coast. He sent a group of men in and they besieged the city. Very quickly, they got in, and only the citadel resisted. The garrison was desperate. They sent an appeal up to Richard, who was way up the coast at Acre.
Richard reacted immediately. He gathered a tiny force of only 55 knights and crossbowmen and sailed down the coast to Jaffa. On the beach just in front of the town, Richard would display his inspired military leadership. The Crusaders were staring defeat in the face. But showing immense personal bravery, Richard was beginning to turn the battle around, as Saladin looked on.
Both these men developed a healthy and real respect for one another in the course of this expedition. I think Saladin knew that Richard was a real military force to be reckoned with. And I think Richard knew that Saladin was almost unique in the Muslim world in the fact that he'd created this unified empire.
Saladin's admiration for the Crusader king grew as he watched Richard drive the Muslim forces off the beach and into the town. The battle was fought street by street as the Christians tried to take Jaffa back from Saladin's troops. During the battle, a volley of arrows brought down Richard's horse. Seeing the king vulnerable and exposed, Saladin ordered his men to send him a replacement. As the battle wore on, both sides were overcome by exhaustion and fatigue. But ultimately, Richard's highly disciplined and organized army proved too much for Saladin's men, and they retreated. By September 1192, the two armies had fought each other to a standstill. Saladin faced increasing discontent from his Muslim allies.
He was no longer sure that he could maintain this level of armed struggle and armed warfare indefinitely. The reason for that was that his soldiers were from the lands. They had not come from abroad. They had not been paid. They were not going to follow their leaders till kingdom come. These were people who came from neighboring villages, who came from the towns, who had families, who had property, who had lands they had to tend to, and they did not like being away from that permanently.
Saladin decided the best option was to make a truce with Richard the Lionheart. It was agreed the Christians would keep the coastline towns from Jaffa to Tyre, but Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands. As a concession, Christian pilgrims would be allowed to enter Jerusalem to worship at the Holy Sepulchre. Richard the Lionheart himself never set foot in the Holy City. He refused to enter Jerusalem as long as it was in the hands of his enemy. In October 1192, Richard left for Europe. Saladin received an envoy from his arch-rival, pledging he would return to wrest the whole territory of Jerusalem back once he had raised more money and men. Through messengers, Saladin sent his reply. If the land were to be lost, he would rather it be taken into Richard's mighty power than into the hands of any other prince. Just 6 months later, in March 1193, Saladin was dead at the age of 56, worn out by more than 5 years of relentless marching, sieges, and battle. His loyal friend Baha al-Din recalled the sad day.
He arrived when he was already dead and transported to God's favor and the seat of his grace. The citadel, the city, the world was overwhelmed by such a sense of loss as God alone could comprehend. Each man's grief, sorrows, tears, and cries for help kept him from looking at anyone else. بارك الله في خليفته ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن.
I think Saladin's legacy was that he was the man who captured back Jerusalem. capturing it really fulfilled many aspirations among the Muslims of the Middle East.
But for Richard the Lionheart, there was bitter irony in Saladin's death, so soon after he left the Holy Land.
Had Richard stayed just over that one last winter, his chief enemy would have gone. The Muslim world fragmented. There was a real succession struggle after Saladin's death. Richard would have been perfectly placed to exploit that.
Richard the Lionheart never returned to the Holy Land. He died in 1199 from an arrow wound he received while fighting in Europe. Crusades would be periodically launched over the next 100 years, but the enthusiasm for reclaiming the Holy Land eventually began to wane.
Really, this movement only achieves one victory, only has one success, and that's the First Crusade. The reality, of course, is that the Crusades never really managed to dominate Islam in the course of the 12th and 13th century, and that really, throughout that period, they're fighting a losing battle. They're trying desperately to hold on or to retake, and they never achieve full victory.
In 1291, the last Christian outpost, Acre, fell to the Muslims. The 200-year Crusader military occupation of the Holy Land was over, but the psychological scars remained.
The Crusades had a very deep impact on Arab society. They were seen as a barbarian incursion, and stories of those Crusades are still told in cafes and in families as if they happened yesterday. And so whenever the West has invaded that region again, people say it's another crusade.
After their victory in the First Crusade, the Christians struggled desperately to keep hold of the Holy Land. Yet in the end, Saladin's capture of Jerusalem in 1187 was the death knell to the Christian cause. The Crusades saw the collision of two civilizations, each fighting for the Holy Land, each believing God was on their side.
Nur al-Din's eyes, if there was any chance of defeating the Crusaders. And there was also a big worry on the part of Nur al-Din that if we don't take it, the Crusaders might.
The Crusaders also coveted Cairo. Egypt was a rich and strategically positioned country, and in the early 1160s, it was up for grabs. Egypt wanted to remain independent. It was the stronghold of the Shia branch of Islam, and was just as determined to resist Nur al-Din's Sunni Orthodox Muslims as the Christians. But in 1168, the Christians made a fatal mistake and handed Nur al-Din a great advantage. The Crusaders perpetrated a brutal massacre of Shia Muslims in an Egyptian town near Cairo.
If the Crusaders have acted differently, they would have taken Cairo with the greatest of ease. For the city notables were ready to surrender it. But when they heard of the massacres perpetrated by the Christians, they decided to resist. The Egyptians were left with little choice but to plead with Nur al-Din for help.
Nur al-Din was only too eager to help. He sent in his most talented and ambitious young general to help the Egyptians defend Cairo. His name was Saladin.
Something to do with those convenient demises. That's impossible to prove. People did die with distressing regularity.
By the end of 1169, with all his rivals conveniently out of the way, Saladin was now the unchallenged ruler of Egypt, controlling as much territory as his mentor, Nur al-Din.
Nur al-Din used to call Saladin the ambitious. Definitely, Nur al-Din wanted to punish Saladin for his treason.
5 years later, before he could cut his young lieutenant down to size, Nur al-Din died under mysterious circumstances. He was 57. Saladin rushed from Cairo to Nur al-Din's fortress stronghold, Aleppo, but a successor had already been announced. The son of Nur al-Din was the new ruler of Syria, al-Salih. He was just 12. But young as he was, al-Salih was no pushover. He refused to allow Saladin to enter the city and forced his army to camp outside the gates of Aleppo. The young leader then took his boldest step. He called on the services of a group of religious fundamentalist hitmen to eliminate his rival. Their name has gone down in history: the Assassins.
The word assassin is derived from hashishin.
To the Muslim world, Saladin is a legend. His heroic reputation was carefully crafted by one man, his close friend and confidant, Baha al-Din.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمد.
Baha al-Din was close to and a great admirer of Saladin.
I bore witness to the genuineness of the rare stories told about the noble hero, Saladin.
Like a medieval spin doctor, he put a gloss on the great deeds of his master.
One could swear that from the time he set out, he did not spend one silver coin except on a jihad.
Saladin shared his master Nur al-Din's ambition to control both Syria and Egypt and drive out the Crusaders, but under his own leadership. And that meant taking on Nur al-Din himself. His first step was to assume command of all of Egypt from the Shia rulers, by any means necessary.
The fact that some people who were in Saladin's way, in his path to power, conveniently died at appropriate moments, has led other people to suggest at the time and since that Saladin had...
His rival, al-Salih, now 19 years old, died, like his father and grandfather before him, another victim to die in uncertain circumstances.
I have no problems in believing that Saladin was ruthless. What's the problem? I mean, in order to survive in that world, you had to be. Whether he was responsible for the killing of Nur al-Din's son, one doesn't know.
Syria and Egypt now belonged to Saladin. 80 years of Muslim disunity were over.
Now he has encircled the Crusader states. He is threatening to strangle them into oblivion. And I think what we can see happening as far as the Crusaders are concerned is a real heightening of the temperature, a heightening of the level of threat, and an awareness that really things are moving inexorably towards some kind of serious confrontation.
Having fought and bullied the Muslim world into a coalition, Saladin would now have to deliver a knockout blow against the Christians of the Holy Land. By 1183, Saladin was at last ready to strike against the Christians and claim Jerusalem. The ambition of the greatest Muslim leader in the century hung like a cloud over the Crusaders as they prepared to do battle for their kingdom.
Any rise in Saladin's power was a cause for suspicion in our eyes. He was a man.
Hashish, we all know, is marijuana. And the story was that the only way they could be worked up to go and kill someone was by drugging them out of their skulls.
The assassins tracked Saladin down to his tent outside the city walls. They got through his guards, killing one of them. Saladin was lucky to escape with only a flesh wound.
The assassination of Saladin would have been a tremendous blow to the cause. And when the assassin actually got into his tent, must have created total panic. You can just imagine it.
A year passed before Saladin returned, determined to capture Aleppo. This time he was taking no chances. He ringed his quarters with guards and even scattered chalk dust and cinders around the tent to detect footprints. Still, despite the security, the assassins struck again, in a curious and disturbing way. By his pillow, they left a present, some pastries, and with them a death note, warning Saladin to retreat, or next time they would succeed in assassinating him. Saladin fled Aleppo again. It was 7 years before Saladin's fortunes changed. In 1181,